I've got two hands and three things, okay. I've got an empty page, right, because my main title is Conquering the Empty Page, Writing Strategies. So I think this is something that we've all faced before, the empty page or the empty screen. Okay, now I'll happily take it now, thank you very much. Okay, so very important, not rules, but suggestions, okay. I'll start with strategy 1, and I might also say with resource 1, because as a writer, as an academic writer, you're also a strategist, so someone who pulls together his or her resources when you're writing. The first thing is, it's where I start, is know the requirements. And know the requirement. What is required of the paper that I need to write? Okay. What is required in terms of what are the formal requirements? First of all, what is required in terms of length? What's required in terms of the type of paper that is required? The structure. I'll come back to structure in a while. And that very often has to do with something that, as a student, you find out maybe after the fact than before the fact, namely my supervisor's expectations. Okay. This is something that we see in writing consultations where papers sometimes fail because the expectations haven't been clarified. That is certainly true of bachelor's and master's theses. So know the requirements and the expectations. Strategy 2, get organised. I've got some wonderful inspiration here from someone I very, very much admire. Paul Sylvia. Paul Sylvia is a professor of psychology in North Carolina, whose specialism is human creativity. And I was quite struck by the fact that he's written 2 books on academic writing. One is called How to Write a Lot, a productive guide to academic writing. And he says basically you write a lot if you're organised. He's also very interesting because he doesn't believe there is such a thing as writer's block. He says people who have writer's block simply aren't writing enough, which I find a very interesting statement. So his 3 questions about getting organised, which would be my second strategy, is, well, where do I write? When do I write? And what do I want to write? One of the things that we see with when students come along to writing consultations, sometimes their ambitions, they're too ambitious. They say, well, I'm going to write my introduction in half a day. And I say, really? You might plan the introduction maybe in half a day, but write it in half a day. Depends on your preparation. Then I'd like to see your outline, for instance. How detailed is your outline for your introduction for any section of your paper? So I think a good place to start is, after knowing the requirements, is you get organised, right? It helps, for example, and Karina was talking about this before, in terms of, well, when do I write? When are my best writing times? And that you would also sort of work with a weekly plan. That's particularly useful with longer papers, that you would plan your weeks, so that writing isn't something that happens by accident, but it's actually something that you plan. Okay. Strategy 3, what interests me? It might sound simplistic, but again, speaking from day-to-day experience with writing consultations, with working with students, people will come along and say, here's my research question, does it work? And then my first question is, well, why do you actually want to write about this topic? And it helps basically if you just say, well, I want to write about this topic because, and you start writing. So you generate material, you get to understand your own interest. And you get, therefore, to define your interest. And that would be my third strategy. It's often an underused resource. You can, of course, also consider, and we would encourage that you discuss your interest with others. Because writing, one of the peculiarities or characteristics of writing is, well, it's something that we do alone, right? We tend to write alone, most of us. Strategy 4, developing your research question There's a wonderful strategy developed by Booth and his colleagues in a book called The Craft of Research, which we use in writing consultations, where we basically say, okay, if you've got a research question, how does it reflect your interest? And then you can basically, you run that research question through 3 steps. First, what is the topic? Well, I'm working on. Secondly, well, what is the question? Because I want to find out how. How is a good question word because it's problem focused. In other words, a how question tells the reader that you have identified a problem that you consider worth solving. And therefore you need to ask a question that helps address the problem. The third step is, so going from topic to question, is the significance. You need to justify the question. Readers want to know, well, okay, if this is your question, what am I going to learn from reading your paper? What am I going to better understand? The hardest question that the reader can ask a writer is, well, so what? Why should I care? It's the, well, why this question and not another question? Strategy 5, find a structure. Now, it could be, as so often in academic writing, that the structure of your paper is given, right? This is true with many journal submissions. You're writing an empirical paper, and the journal says, well, we would like an IMRAD paper, Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. Highly canonized, so everyone goes and writes IMRAD papers and publishes them. Now, with your assessment paper or bachelor's thesis or master's thesis, I think one of the challenges is to find a structure that is appropriate to your research question, because every part of your paper needs to contribute to answering your research question. So where does your structure come from? It comes from basically the research question and dividing that research question into steps that you want to take the reader through. Strategy 6. I go back to my empty page. Sometimes students come to writing consultations and they say, I'd like to talk about the second part of my literature review. And then I say, okay, let's have a look at it. And then they start searching because they have a long document, maybe 50 pages, and they start looking for this. And then I sometimes think that's not very efficient or economical. So that's why one of my own writing strategies is to know, did I skip? Yes. Yes, I did. Thanks so much. You see, I'm galloping. I'm getting ahead of myself. Create a separate document for every section. Why? Because writing a paper can be a complex matter. I know that most people write in one document, but the larger your paper is, it helps basically to say, okay, let me have one Word document for my introduction, one for my literature review, one for my methods, one for my results, and so forth, and on it goes, because you're going to be much more careful. You're going to plan each part of your paper in much greater detail. In other words, you're going to be far more aware of what journey is your reader going to make through this particular section, right? And also it helps when you then come for a writing consultation and you say you want to talk about the second part of your literature review, then I don't have to sort of sit there twiddling thumbs until you found page 33 where the second part of your literature review starts. Okay? I'm joking. Know what every section requires. I have down there, I have brought with me the 2023 edition of the Introduction to Academic Writing Reader. Because one of the great things about that document is it actually tells you as an assessment student what is required in the introduction. It doesn't tell you exactly, well, it does tell you what the main section is, but it doesn't actually do you the favour of creating a structure for that main section. You have to do that yourself. But at least it also tells you what points you need to cover in the abstract, what points you need to cover in the introduction. That's already very helpful. And the idea behind that is that you can make your writing more efficient if you make it slightly more goal-driven. What goals do I want to achieve in this particular section? Okay. One source that I recommend, particularly when people are writing a bachelor's or master's thesis, is a book by Adrian Woolwork called English for Writing Research Papers, where he has a chapter on every part of a research paper or thesis, which starts with guiding questions. And those guiding questions become like a checklist. And if you basically then say, okay, I need to work through those guiding questions and through that checklist, you are then actually becoming a very strategic writer, a very resourceful writer. Adrian Woolwork, English for Writing Research Papers. There is a PDF on the Writing Lab's community space. Okay, that by way of a commercial. Strategy 8. People come along to writing consultations and say, could you look at my outline? Is that okay? And they sort of show me a table of contents, and I say, well, actually, it's too vague. I'd like you to be more specific. I'd like more detail. I'd really like to understand why the paper is structured in the way it is, or why each section is structured in the way it is. So, if you connect, I think it was strategy 6, namely create a separate document for every section, and you connect that with outline every section separately, which means you would then, on your empty page or empty screen, it would say literature review. You'd have your goals, in other words, your guiding questions, and then you'd have an outline. How exactly do you intend to take the reader through this particular section? If you do that section by section, that's a far more systematic, far more strategic approach to writing than if you just basically rely on one single table of contents. Of course, one might argue, well, do I need to write from an outline at all, or can't I simply write and find out what I'm thinking? Of course you can, but ultimately you still need to comply with the basic requirement, which is you have to fulfill the requirements, which goes back to strategy 1, know the requirements. Strategy 9, we don't do enough of this, namely validate your draft outline. Show it to a peer. Get a peer to look at your outline, and does it make sense to them? It helps, for example, if you write out, that then becomes your the last part of your introduction is always, well, you know, the paper is divided, or the paper has 5 sections. What are those 5 sections? How do I get from section 2 to section 3 to section 4, etc.? Get someone to validate that outline. Start with a peer. If peers have no time, well, you know, they're also very busy. Ask your tutor. If your tutor has no time, you could come to the Writing Lab. We're happy to help. Strategy 10, draft a first version. And I say first version because your first version cannot be your final version. It's only actually the start of what everybody knows who has been writing, namely that writing is rewriting, is rewriting, is rewriting, because ultimately we want to present the clearest possible thinking. Strategy 11, last but not least, ask your introduction to academic writing tutor, or, of course, us at the Writing Lab. Thank you.